Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Pick Your Poison, Volume 1. I've been a police officer in Mineral Wells, Texas for going on 5 years now. If you're wondering, Mineral Wells is about 50 miles west of Fort Worth and has a population of about 16,000. The people here are salt-of-the-earth type people, God-fearing, hard-working, and kind. But something has always been a little off about them, almost like they're carrying a secret that no one is supposed to know. Mineral Wells becomes a ghost town, no pun intended, after 7 p.m., and driving the streets at night can be downright creepy, even from the safety of my patrol car. In the 5 years I've been here, I've seen and heard some strange things. Things I don't even believe myself at times. If I hadn't had my own strange experience when I was a child, I'd probably think I was crazy, but I'm not. The things that happen here are sometimes unexplainable, but they are real. And I'd like to tell you one of my experiences. Perhaps I'll tell you more. To understand Mineral Wells, you have to first understand its history. I learned most of this after I visited the local historical society about 6 months after I moved here. Apparently, the town was settled in 1881 by a guy named J.A. Lynch. After Lynch dug the first drinking water well, he claimed that the strange-tasting water cured his rheumatism. Mrs. Lynch claimed that the water had cured her arthritis as well. Mineral-enriched water had prime medicinal value in the 1800s, and soon the word got out about its healing properties. A second well was dug several years later, and then a third. It was out of this third well that a woman with dementia often drank. Guess what happened? Her dementia was miraculously cured. The local children started calling this third well the Crazy Water Well, and eventually the term crazy water was coined for the miraculous water that flowed from the earth. News about this crazy water spread far and wide, and by the early 1900s, Mineral Wells had become the South's greatest health resort, with hundreds of mineral wells, bathhouses, spas, hotels, and the like. People traveled from all over the country in hopes of experiencing the healing power of the crazy water themselves. As you'd probably imagine, many of these visitors were old or infirm, and many never made it out of town alive. Today, Mineral Wells is a shadow of its former self. While it still has some industry, it operates mainly as a tourism and retirement community. But don't let that fool you. In this town, Faulkner's famous quote holds deeper meaning for those of us who choose to call it our home. The past is never dead. It's not even past. After I had been on the force for about a month, I had my first experience with the strangeness of Mineral Wells. We had gotten a frantic 911 call about a dead body. I still remember the address, 200 Hubbard Street, the address of the Baker Hotel. I was working nights at the time. Apparently, that's where the rookies start. And the call came in about 12:30 a.m. My partner and I were in the area, and it didn't take us very long to get there. When we arrived, the 911 caller was gone, but the body was there, just as described. It turned out to be a young woman. She was splayed out on the red brick steps that led up to the front entrance, her back obviously broken and her head completely smashed. Also, she was totally nude. It was the first dead body I had seen, and it was gruesome. You didn't have to be an expert to determine she had fallen from a great height. I remember looking up to see if there was any balconies that she could have fallen from. There weren't, but there were plenty of windows, and since this was an old hotel, they didn't have the safety features that modern-day hotel windows have. In fact, many of the windows were open. I later learned the Baker Hotel had been shut down in the 70s, but no one would ever admit as to why. We secured the scene and called in the investigative unit. The girl turned out to be a 29-year-old Pamela Allen. She had been a resident of Mineral Wells all her life and worked as a manager at a local cafe. On the night in question, Pamela had been out with some girlfriends at a bar that was near the hotel. One of the girls who had been with her told the investigators that they had all been hanging out on the 7th floor of the hotel drinking after the bars closed, when they suddenly realized that Pamela was nowhere to be found. They began looking for her and found her clothes in a pile in one of the rooms next to an open window. That's when they realized that she had fallen and they called 911. There were only 2 bits of information they could offer. The first was that Pamela had been overheard saying she needed to go meet Virginia, but none of them knew any friends of hers by that name. The second was that there were rumors in town that she'd been having an affair with the owner of the cafe she worked at, but none of them admitted to ever seeing her with him. When I heard all this, it seriously disturbed me. By all accounts, Pamela was a well-adjusted young woman and had no reason to kill herself. Why did she do it? And why did she take all of her clothes off before jumping? After the full investigation, I didn't hear much about the case again. The investigators thought the circumstances were odd, but odd things happen in mineral wells, and they had more pressing cases. The case was closed. It wasn't until about 5 months later, as I was poring over manuscripts at the Historical Society archives, that I came across a passage that made the hair stand up on my neck. Here's what it said. One story involving the Baker Hotel revolves around the woman known as Virginia Brown, a resident at the hotel, who was the alleged mistress of T.B. Baker, the owner and builder of the hotel. According to legend, Virginia was upset over the affair and drunkenly plunged to her death after jumping from the 13th floor. Many visitors to the hotel before its closing in 1972 had reported seeing a bloody woman, sometimes wearing a red dress and sometimes nude, roaming the halls after midnight. This freaked me out, and I was about to nope right on out of there, but before I did, I realized there was a reference to another document. It turned out to be the hotel's ledger from the mid-1900s. I searched for Virginia Brown's name and found it. She had been a resident at that time, and there was a notation under the room heading, Room 714. It was then I knew there was something extremely strange going on in Mineral Wells, Texas. But what exactly? One day, about 4 months after the incident at the Baker Hotel, my partner and I were called to disturbance at the Veterans Affairs building on Southeast 6th Avenue. Sometimes we would switch shifts with the day patrol, and this was one of those days. When we arrived, there was a crowd of people outside, most of whom looked visibly shaken. As we approached the door, I understood why. The sounds coming from inside were downright terrifying. Deep, guttural moans and screams emanated through the air. The sounds were so unnatural that we could not make an initial determination whether the person making them was male or female. If I'm being honest, at the time I wasn't sure about whether they were even human. We entered into the foyer with pistols drawn and quickly cleared it and the surrounding rooms. All the employees had made it outside, which was good. I immediately noticed the air inside had a strangely cold, damp quality to it, unheard of for summer in Texas, even with the air on. And maybe it was just my imagination, but the sounds seemed to not only be coming from the office at the back of the building, but also from the walls around us. And what was that other thing? Whispers? I glanced at my partner, but he seemed wholly focused on the door in front of us. We moved forward to check the handle and found that it was locked. We announced ourselves, but it was soon clear the person inside had no interest in opening the door. My partner, being larger, leaned back and then drove his foot right into the handle of the door, breaking the door frame and sending the cheap door flying inwards. For a split second, and I know this sounds crazy, but I could have sworn the man inside was wearing a long white doctor's coat and white mask over his mouth. A half second later, the image in my mind was gone, and before us stood a visibly disturbed older gentleman wearing green fatigues and brandishing a letter opener. It was one of those relatively large but dull kind like you get from the Rotary Club. What little hair he had left was sticking straight out from his head, like when you rub your hair against a balloon. He was babbling, mostly incoherently, but we could make out a few words between the moans and cries. Not the water again. Not the water. It's cold, so cold. It's time for your treatment. I'm a better boy, so much better. I won't run, I won't. He moved quickly, raising the hand with a letter opener. My partner yelled out, "Drop it!" as we aimed our firearms in unison. Then, without warning, the man placed his hand palm down on the desk next to him and drove the letter opener into the back of his hand with such force that had somehow pierced the wood on the desk. He looked straight at us with that pale face, eyes cold and wide with fear, and gasped, "He's coming," and collapsed to the floor. I stayed with the man while my partner ran outside to grab the paramedics. When I was doing my final sweep of the office, I happened to notice a large, half-empty box of mineral water, collected and bottled right here in town by the Crazy Minerals Company. I grabbed the bottle and shoved it into my pocket. As the paramedics were wheeling him out, the initial explanation for his actions was possibly early signs of dementia, by the way. My partner called my attention to a small brass sign that had been erected on the outside of the building. It read, "Millings Sanitarium, National Register of Historic Places, Mineral Wells, Texas, 1929. After the incident at Veterans Affairs, I wanted to learn all I could about mineral wells, and about a week later I went to the Historical Society on my day off, as I mentioned, to learn about its unusual history. Later that night, I found myself alone as usual in my apartment, deep in thought. I tried not to think about what had happened with the old man, but I couldn't push it from my mind. It was so strange, and the fact that the building had been a sanitarium at one point made it even stranger. At this point, I wasn't even sure I believed in ghosts or the undead, but what had happened sure pointed to some kind of possession. The only thing I really knew was that I had experienced two otherworldly events, neither of which seemed to be connected, but together seemed to point to something sinister going on in mineral wells. What was causing these terrible things to happen? And what connection did they have, if any, to the history of the town? And what did the crazy water have to do with it? I considered leaving mineral wells briefly, but then scrapped that idea. I was going to stay and do what I was hired to do, which was to protect and serve the citizens of the great state of Texas, and possibly, if I was lucky, start figuring out the grand secret that seemed to be lurking just beneath the surface. I decided that plan would start with my partner, Officer James Orr, a 15-year veteran of the Mineral Wells Police Department and a lifelong resident of Mineral Wells. The next night, while on patrol, I brought up the subject of the man at Veterans Affairs to James. "Crazy old man, huh?" he said. "He almost got himself shot. Did you notice anything strange about him?" I asked pensively. At this point, I wasn't planning on admitting what I had thought I had seen and heard, fearing he would think I was a lunatic. Other than the fact that he stabbed himself with a dull letter opener, not really. It was a little cold in that office, but that's not that odd. Weird shit like that happens in mineral wells sometimes. It's kind of a running joke around here, you know. I'm sure you've heard of the crazy water." He laughed as he said it, so I was pretty sure he didn't buy into it being anything out of the ordinary. "You drink that stuff?" I asked. I certainly didn't and wasn't planning to anytime soon. "Sure. Everyone here drinks it. It has an odd taste, but you get used to it. My grandmother's family moved in here in the 1920s, believe it or not, to see if the crazy water would cure my great-grandmother's schizophrenia. It was a snake oil salesman's heyday back then. The mineral well was supposed to cure anything and everything, and I know my great-grandmother had to make great sacrifices to get here. I'm not sure whether it worked or not, but she died here sometime after giving birth to my grandmother in 1931. I still have an old picture of her standing in front of one of the crazy water wells. You know, it's funny, and I haven't admitted this to anyone before, so don't think I'm crazy. But several years before you got here, I responded to a strange call involving an old woman who had taken too many of her pills and was worried that she was going to die. Ellie, I think her name was. After I arrived, I called poison control to make sure she was going to be okay. The woman on the line stated that Ellie should get checked out if she started feeling ill, but that the quantity of what she took was not lethal. I comforted her a bit, was about to leave, but she stopped me dead in my tracks with a peculiar story. She said that as she was about to take her pills, a young lady had instructed her to take the entire bottle. "Dump 'em all down my throat," as she had put it. For some reason, she had listened, and had taken about a fourth of the bottle before snapping out of it. Confused, I asked her who the young lady was. She said matter-of-factly, "The lady that watches me through the window." Odd, right? So naturally, I asked her which window it was, and she said it was the one in her bedroom. Now, this lady was probably in her 80s and most likely demented, but I still wanted to check out and make sure no one was in the house. I walked back to the bedroom and opened the door. and for a split second I thought I saw a face in the window across from the bedroom door. The next moment it was gone. I searched the room, the closet, and the bathroom, but no one was there. Aside from a slightly strange smell, which I attributed to the age of the house and its contents, nothing was amiss. I checked outside. No one to be found. The place was empty except for the owner, and there was no sign that anyone had been inside the home. The craziest thing? The face I saw. I swear, I will go to the grave with this memory. It was the exact same face I've seen 1,000 times standing in front of that damn mineral well. It was my great-grandmother's. After James confided in me about his experience with his great-grandmother's ghost, we didn't really talk about things like that again for a while. Even though he believed he may have experienced something and most likely seen other odd things in his time as a police officer, he still didn't really believe in the paranormal, although he wanted to. Almost like there was a veil in front of his eyes which prevented him from seeing what was really happening in mineral wells. I, on the other hand, had abandoned all hope of talking myself out of believing in this stuff. I was fully invested. I had my next run-in about a year later. James was out sick, the flu I believe, and I responded to a vagrancy call at the old Norwood Hospital. It had been abandoned for some time, and we had gotten constant reports that a man was living on the 3rd floor and making a racket at all hours of the night. Initially, the police department had sort of looked the other way, the reason for which I was not privy to, but this time I was told to go over there immediately and get him out if possible. I arrived just after 10 p.m. and parked my squad car across the street. The Norwood Hospital had been built sometime around 1904. I believe Dr. Norwood and his wife had moved to Mineral Wells around that time. It was used as a private hospital as far as I know, and Dr. Norwood apparently even had some ties to T.B. Baker, but I couldn't recall what it was. As I was walking up to the entrance, I noticed the flicker of a light in the 3rd story window, most likely a candle confirming that someone was up there. The front door was still boarded up, but there was a window on the left side of the front of the building that had been broken and all of the glass removed. I pulled out my flashlight and climbed in. The inside of the building had decayed with age, and all the signs you'd expect in a vagrancy were present. There were old clothes on the floor, empty food containers, beer cans, and the place was in extremely poor condition. The smell was awful too. I checked the 1st floor and found nothing. There was an open door that appeared to lead to a basement, but I decided that would not be on my agenda for the night. The 2nd floor was much like the 1st, except there was also a room that looked like it may have been a nursery or a child's playroom, littered with old stuffed toys, a rocking horse, and several rotting bunk beds. Just as you'd expect, it creeped me out royally. When I got to the stairs that led to the 3rd floor, I heard something rustling up in the darkness above me. I'm not going to lie. I was not really happy about having to go up there, but the top brass had made it clear that I needed to take care of this tonight. "It's the police," I announced to the black boy. "If you're up there, I need you to come down." I sat in silence for a minute, listening. Nothing but the wind outside. I began to slowly ascend the stairs with my flashlight as my guide and my hand on my hip. I swung my flashlight across the room and saw a figure, huddled in the corner under several blankets covering his face. I began to walk towards him cautiously. I smelled the man before I really saw him, but once I did, I realized the smell was more discernible. He appeared to be in his 50s, but I had the feeling he was much younger. His fingers were gnarled and his face bore the mask of addiction and depression. When he began to mumble, I noticed his teeth were black and crumbling. "Mariana, is that you?" Something indecipherable. "Take me. Now?" "Sir, I need you to show me your hands." "What are you doing up here?" I said. This time he spoke more loudly. "The children. They won't leave me alone, the poor children. They are missing pieces. Are you here to take me? The children are always playing. They are never quiet. They went to meet the doctor. The water didn't help. They always tell me I never sleep. Are you here to take me?" There had obviously been no children in this building for quite some time, but maybe his encounter with them had been of a different sort. I stood the man up and searched his person, finding $2 in one pocket and a burnt-up piece of tin foil in the other. I checked his fingers, and sure enough, he had the telltale signs of long-term meth use, burnt fingers and all. Meth had always been a relatively serious problem in mineral wells. It's cheap, can be made with mostly household chemicals, and once they start, they can't escape its grip, often for life. I threatened to arrest him for possession of paraphernalia, but he agreed to tell me where he got the meth from instead. Lions Park, as the dopeheads called it, a place well known for its drug activity. He didn't have any of it on him, but I did explain to him that he'd be arrested for trespassing. He seemed relieved as I escorted him down the third-floor stairs. Back on the second floor, I noticed something I hadn't before, scrawled in some dark substance on the wall at the bottom of the stairs. The man, Victor was his name, it would turn out, noticed it too and just started quietly sobbing to himself. We exited as quickly as possible. As I drove off towards the station, I recalled that I had seen a light in the third-floor window when I had first arrived. However, there hadn't been any candles, lit or otherwise, when I had gotten up there. I glanced in my rearview window at the old hospital receding in the background, expecting to see only darkness, but instead, the telltale spark of a candle flickered back, the wind in the trees carrying the faint laughter of children. Several days later, I paid my first visit to Mary Scott. Miss Scott was known in the community as being a reputable source of mineral wells lore, as well as for her discretion. She had taught at one of the local schools in the 70s and 80s and had retired to her small but well-kept estate on the south side of town, outside the city limits. James had actually set us up. She had taught him in kindergarten and then again in middle school. The Norwood incident had pushed me into full investigation mode, and I needed some answers. I believed this was as good a start as any. I arrived at her place in mid-afternoon, dressed in plain clothes, so as not to attract any attention to myself. Now that I was actively seeking information on paranormal activity in mineral wells, I had to be extra careful. At this point, I wasn't even entirely sure I could trust this woman, but I didn't really have any choice. Her home was a small, cozy brick house tucked several hundred feet off the road. A narrow driveway guided me under the sprawling arms of several mature oaks. There was a small pond off to the side with a weathered dock and several dogs panting about. I knocked on the door and was quickly greeted by a woman who appeared to be in her 60s, considerably shorter than me and just beginning to gray around her temples, with kind eyes and a knowing smile. A teacher for sure, and someone who seemed to be wise beyond her years. She invited me in, and with a "thank you, ma'am," I graciously accepted. After some small talk about James and my move to mineral wells, we sat down in the living room with our iced teas and got down to business. "What can I help you with, dear?" she asked. "Miss Scott, Mary, sorry, I'm not exactly sure how to put this, but I'm just going to come out and say it. I've experienced some things in mineral wells that I can't quite explain rationally," I said with hesitation. "Go on," she said knowingly. "Well, there's something odd about mineral wells. I've encountered spirits or people possessed by spirits multiple times since I started work here. The problem is no one else sees them. Does that sound crazy?" "Tell me something," she started. "Do you drink the mineral water, the crazy water as they call it?" "No, I don't." I said, "I have a bottle at my apartment, but it's currently unopened." "Good. Keep it that way," she said, sipping her tea. "Most of what I know comes second and third hand from stories passed down through the generations, and the rest from countless hours studying old deeds, contracts, journal entries, and any other documents I could get my hands on. You're right. Something is rotten in mineral wells. Mineral hells, as I call it. It all started with that cursed mineral water old man Lynch summoned from the ground all those years ago. By all accounts, he was a sociopath and a scoundrel. I don't drink it either anymore, and from what I've gathered, that's what allows people like us to actually see what's going on. Most of the locals have lived on it all their lives. It's made them blind to the true face of this godforsaken town. It also may make them more susceptible to suggestion, even possession, by the other side." Suddenly, several things made sense at once. Pamela was born in mineral wells and lived here her entire life, and I would venture a guess that Ellie and the man at the VA had too. It also made sense now why James wasn't able to come to grips with the things he had seen. "What's wrong with the water?" I asked. "That's a good question. I believe Mr. Lynch tapped into more than he bargained for when he dug that first mineral well. It sparked the chain of events that has somehow caused the dead to remain in mineral wells long after they have passed. The water itself does have extremely high levels of lithium, but I suspect there's something more to it that causes folks to turn a blind eye to the influence the spirits have on our world. There are others, though, like us, that know the truth." "Mary, there is so much more that I want to know," I started, now getting excited. "Do you know anything about Dr. Norwood? I have a feeling he is somehow involved in all of this." "Not much. Only whispers here and there. A name kept coming up. Marianne, I believe." "Marianne?" I asked, remembering the name hellishly scrawled on the hospital wall. "Yes, that's it, Mariana," she went on. "She was Dr. Norwood's head nurse for much of the time the hospital was open. I believe he was an osteopath by trade, but there were rumors that something else was going on there. What exactly, I'm not sure. Many years ago I heard the records are said to be hidden somewhere in the building, but I couldn't begin to tell you where or if they're there at all." She went on, but the sound of her voice faded from my consciousness and was replaced by a singular picture, the dingy wooden stairs leading down into the basement of the Norwood Hospital. If the records were still in the building, they were down there. Finding them was the first step in unlocking this mystery. I had to find them. I reluctantly cut our conversation short, thanking Mary and telling her we would meet again. I promised to share any further information I found with her. I got the feeling that as I was leaving that she had stuck her neck out by talking to me, and I was grateful for her help. As I drove back down the long driveway under those old oaken sentinels, picturing Mary alone with her tea and her dogs, I felt a feeling of sadness and weight envelop me, like being wrapped in a thick blanket on the bottom of the ocean. I drove on. That night, I parked my squad car across the street from the Norwood, as I had several days earlier. I was on the clock and could easily explain my purpose for being here if questioned about it. And sure enough, as I stepped out of my vehicle, I could see the light again, flickering in the third-floor window like a modern-day will-o-wisp. I opened the trunk and grabbed the black satchel inside. Once inside the building, I navigated through the grime and decay to the black hole in the wall that led down to the basement. Thank God for flashlights, I thought. The darkness there seemed palpable, like it was a living entity all its own. I started down the steps, 10 in all, and counted each as I went. If I were to lose my light source for any reason, or if I was running, I'd at least have a decent chance of getting back up the stairs without falling and hurting myself. I had also noted that it was 22 steps roughly from the door to the basement stairs. You can never be too careful. Once I made it down, I felt the grit of soil beneath my boots. I guess it made sense that the basement wasn't fully complete in a building as old as this. Surprisingly, it was relatively clean down there, but that was the only positive. The air was damp and musty and heavy with the weight of the building's history. As I swung my flashlight, the darkness retreated on cue, but grudgingly. Old equipment littered the floor along with some decayed furniture and other furnishings. I didn't see any filing cabinets, though. No papers, folders, nothing. I cursed myself silently for thinking this was a good idea, but pressed on. The second room felt darker than the first somehow. A cabinet had overturned, and there were broken vials and bottles littering the ground. I stepped around them and was surprised when there wasn't another door in front of me, just an old coal stove, flanked on either side by piles of old bricks and some old rafters. The stairs to the basement were in the back of the building, and I knew I hadn't made it back to the front. I doubled back and made sure there were no other rooms or passageways before heading back to the room with the stove. I shined my light around. I noticed the back wall was brick and that there was a crack running up from behind the stove halfway to the ceiling. Immediately, I began removing bricks from the pile in front of the wall until I had enough room to slowly nudge the iron stove out of the way. It was just as I had thought. At some point, this basement had flooded, eroding the earth beneath the brick wall and causing the bricks to crack, since the wall had no weight to hold it. I had done construction in the past, and I had seen this before. This wall had been built shoddily and probably in a hurry. At the bottom, the bricks weren't being held together by mortar at all. and a few light kicks created just what I needed to proceed. A passageway under the old brick wall into hell for all I knew. My heart was pounding and I absolutely did not want to go in. I have no trouble admitting that now. I had come too far to turn back, so I got on my hands and knees and crawled through the small opening. As I stood up and dusted myself off, my heart froze in my chest. Filing cabinets, rows of them. They were similar to the kind offices use today, except they were made of solid wood, probably oak, and very well preserved for their age. They had brass plates on the outside with descriptions. The rooms appeared to be untouched after all these years. Mary had been right. I walked along the wall quickly, not wanting to waste any more time in this place than I had to, until I found the cabinet I was looking for. The one marked experimental. Experimental. The word itself seemed evil somehow. I slowly opened it, and over the creak of wood sliding on wood, I thought I heard the faint laughter of children. A cold sweat broke out over the skin of my arms, and I got the feeling that I was being watched. I grabbed as many files as I could fit in my satchel, closed the drawer, and turned to leave. That's when I saw them. In the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, was a group of children. I was paralyzed, not by any external force, but by the grip of unadulterated fear. Yes, total fear. They looked back at me, eyes blinking, almost in unison, with gleeful smiles. Then it was as if a record skipped, and the children standing there changed. I recoiled in horror as I realized what I was seeing. The girl standing in front had 2 blank, scarred holes for her eyes. The younger boy next to her waved, his hand barely only 2 fingers and a thumb. Another boy was on the floor, pulling himself forward with the stumps of 2 missing legs dragging behind. There were others in the same condition. The record skipped again, and they were whole, still standing, still again, grinning from ear to ear. I found my body could move again, so I turned and ran as fast as any human ever had before, crawling under the wall before sprinting the rest of the way out of that godforsaken building, back through the basement, 10 steps up, 22 steps out. As I ran, I heard the children singing behind me. As it got louder, I realized it wasn't a song, but a nursery rhyme, one that still haunts me to this very day. 1 for tongue, and 2 for nose, 3 for eyes, and 4 for toes. Ring the bell, the time is near. Ding dong, Marianne is here. Ding dong, Marianne is here. Back at my apartment, I sat alone underneath a single light illuminating my small dining table. Head in my hands, I could still see the young girl's hollow eyes staring blankly back at me. I shuddered, reaching into the satchel on the table and slowly pulling out the 5 folders I had retrieved from the filing cabinet at the Norwood. They were legal-sized, olive in color, and only slightly faded. They looked no different from any other folder you might come across at your office. What they signified, however, was something much more sinister and damning. I reached for one, but couldn't bring myself to open it. I stared at them for a while before putting them back in the satchel and closing the flap. I was exhausted and terrified, and I'd had enough, at least for the night. In the morning, I still couldn't bring myself to look at them. Something had happened to me the night before, the nature of which is hard to explain, but I'll try. I felt dull, not as an uninteresting, but as if the bright and polished parts of me had been scratched off or rubbed away, leaving only raw and faded parts behind. Is that what depression feels like? I think it's easy to pretend you know how you would react if you ever came face to face with a true ghost or spirit. I think what we see in movies and on television desensitizes us to how it would really feel if we experienced it ourselves. That type of terror is not something the mind can manage on its own. I'll tell you that. The body takes over. Instinct, perhaps, something primal, woven in our DNA. It leaves you changed. Left me changed anyway. It was probably almost a week before I mustered the courage to find out what was inside those folders. The first file appeared to be the file for a 7-year-old boy from South Carolina, admitted for the treatment of his leukemia, referred to only as Charlie. I flipped through the pages until I found one with a surgical note, heading entitled Replantation of Severed Limb of Minor Child. It went on to describe in detail a surgical procedure with the purpose of reattaching the subject's severed hand. The words were technical in nature, and I didn't understand some of them. I sat in shock as the realization crept in. I didn't want to believe it. I quickly scanned through the other files, but found similar accounts of gruesome reattachment surgeries, which confirmed what I already suspected. Mariana was cutting up children, and then Dr. Norwood was attempting to put them back together again. The girl with the missing eyes, the nursery rhyme, the room upstairs, even what Victor had said, it all made perfect sense now. Dr. Norwood seemed to be practicing his surgery skills on unsuspecting children who had been admitted for unrelated diseases or ailments. What I didn't understand was how he was getting away with it. Surely the parents didn't stand by and watch their children get cut into pieces by his psychotic nurse. There was more to this, I knew, and I wouldn't find it in these files. I shoved them away in disgust. Afterwards, the depression set in deeper and more fully. I still had a job to do, however, and that was to protect the citizens of Mineral Wells, Texas. I tried to go about my usual work, handling traffic accidents and other small crimes, the typical happenings of a small Texas town. At one point, I think I was hoping that I would forget what had happened and could return to just being a police officer. Maybe then I would feel normal, whole again. But as you obviously know by now, Mineral Wells had other plans for me. I heard one day about a young child from a prominent family in town who had suffered an accident while trying to operate a riding lawnmower, obviously without his parents' permission. The blade had mangled his left arm, all the way up to the elbow, and it ended up having to be amputated. It was reported as a terrible tragedy. I must have been the only one that noticed, based on my close review of the picture that the local newspaper ran of the model of mower that the child had been injured by, that the child's legs couldn't even reach the pedal. There was also the curious case of Brad Delaney, city council president, a member of the First United Methodist Church, who one night took the .45 he had hidden under the mattress and killed his wife in cold blood while she slept. One shot, right to the temple. Brad confessed, saying it must have been him that shot her, seeing as how it was his gun and no one else had been in the house. But he didn't remember doing it. They had found him that morning still asleep next to his murdered wife, the mattress stained in crimson red. One evening, I responded to a report of an awful smell coming from a student's room at Weatherford College, Mineral Wells branch. The student had not been seen in several days, and based on the smell coming from the room, the administration did not want to enter the room themselves, fearing at best a dead body and at worst foul play. The college was located on the old site of Fort Walters, which had been a military installation during World War II. I had run across Fort Walters in the historical archives and knew little about it. At one point during the war, it had been the largest infantry replacement training center in the United States, and several famous World War II soldiers had been trained there. I had run across several accounts of a soldier, apparently afraid of being sent off to war, who committed suicide in the barracks and could still be heard pacing the halls on the anniversary of his death. When I arrived, security led me to the student's room. As reported, the smell was foul and appeared to be that of a decomposing body. The security guard unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. That's when I saw him. In the middle of the room, hanging from a fan by a bedsheet, was a student. His face was bruised and swollen, and his eyes were bulging from his head, wide and red. A female student had passed by the room and screamed out, causing the security guard to frantically remove her from the vicinity, leaving me alone with the corpse. I looked around the room to find any signs of a struggle, but nothing was amiss. That's when I called the investigative unit to take over. I found out several days later about something odd one of the investigative officers had found and couldn't explain. The entire room had been cleaned, with no books, papers, or clothes out of place, except for a single folded piece of paper found under the desk. The officers had thought it would be a suicide note, but the words written inside didn't make any sense to them. They did to me. I cannot go to war. I'm sorry, Mother. Several weeks later, while at a coffee shop that I frequent, only bottled water, no coffee for me, I noticed a man several tables over staring at me. When I looked his way, he sort of flinched and acted like he had been looking somewhere else. I made a mental note of his appearance, 60-ish, dark-haired and wearing some kind of uniform. He was holding a cup of coffee, and I could see that his hands were dirty and gnarled from manual labor. Not exactly the type of person who typically frequents a coffee shop. When I got up to leave, I could feel him watching me. Over the next several weeks, I saw the same man 3 more times, always far enough away to maintain his cover, but close enough to see what I was doing. I was pretty sure he was following me by that point, but honestly had no clues as to why. He seemed harmless enough, so I wasn't frightened, just curious. I got the feeling he was sizing me up, if that makes sense. One day I woke to a note tucked into the side of my door. I opened it and read the hastily scribbled words written on the back of a receipt from a local garage. Coffee shop, 3 p.m. I'll admit, I was a little nervous this person knew where I lived, although it shouldn't have been hard to follow me here. The coffee shop was a safe public space, so I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't go. I had never pictured myself as the type of person that will respond dutifully to the instructions written in shady notes stuffed into my doorframe, but the times, they were a-changing, and depression or not, it was time to get back to my investigation. I arrived at 3 to find my new friend seated in his usual spot. He saw me come in. A moment later, he was out of his seat and walking down the hallway at the back of the shop. I followed him, exiting out of the back door the employees used for taking their out the trash. He was standing there, lighting a cigarette, looking generally nervous and disheveled. Want to tell me why you've been following me, Stan? I started, probably sounding a bit more stern than I actually felt. I found that people tended to follow instructions better if you spoke to them by name, and the patch on his uniform had provided that information. I just had to be sure. Mary told me you two had talked, but I wanted to make sure you were okay for myself, he replied nervously. Mary Scott? I thought. He must be one of the others she had been talking about, those that knew the truth about mineral wells. And what did you find out by following me into a coffee shop, I asked. Well, for starters, all you drink is regular bottled water, no coffee or tap water. Also, I didn't find any of the crazy water bottles outside in the trash at your apartment. A, creepy. B, touchy. I thought this guy was smarter than he looked. So, what am I doing here, I said. He threw down his cigarette. Mary said you knew what was going on in mineral wells. Said you may be trying to do something about it. I wasn't sure I trusted him at this point, and he could see it on my face. Well, don't worry. I don't drink it either. I've never touched the stuff. My father made sure I understood that. Who was your father? He was an orderly at the old milling sanitarium. That damn place. I know of it, I said coldly. I thought you should know what he told me about that place. He paused for a minute, then went on. He said it was the scariest place he ever stepped foot in. He helped with patients, administered medicine, and cleaned the rooms, so he was familiar with the goings-on. He told me about the different types of treatments they would perform on the patients there, electroshock therapy, experimental surgeries, psychological experiments, sleep deprivation studies, even waterboarding. The screams were the worst part, he said. I know they aren't exactly the type of bedtime stories you should tell your children, but I don't think he could help himself. He couldn't sleep for most of his adult life, and my mother died when I was young. The place was hellish, he said, but they always had an influx of new patients regardless of how bad it was. Did he say anything about where all the patients came from? He pieced it together. When news got out about the mineral water, people came from far and wide to be treated. Bathhouses and spas were some of the main attractions for those with less serious ailments of the body, but Millings promised a cure for every dementia and psychological issue under the sun. So the people poured in. Most never left. Business was good. Oh, to be a worm in the peach tree. Worm in the peach tree, I repeated. I hadn't had that turn of phrase before. Oh, it was just something my dad used to say. It basically means someone is taking advantage of a situation. There were also backroom deals with some of the other businesses in town, he went on. I think the Baker management would refer people to Millings, as most of the out-of-towners ended up there first. I also know that Dr. Norwood would sometimes send patients their way. My dad was always the most curious about those patients, he said, because they always seemed to be pretty healthy people, At least when they first got there. They always screamed the loudest. It suddenly got cold and dark where we were standing. I looked up to see the thunderheads rolling in. We'd have some weather tonight. I changed the subject. How do you know Mary? And what is her part in all of this? He looked like he was about to respond, then thought better of it. You'll have to ask her about that one. The bitter, biting rain that began to fall cut off my further conversation between us. Early the next day, after my shift the previous night, I pulled out the files again. I had a hunch about something Stan had said. Plus, the middle of a thunderstorm is always a perfect time to read about sadistic shit. I found Charlie's file and flipped to the page I was looking for. I found the hastily scribbled words again. Mother sent to MS. It wasn't a person. It was a place. Millings Sanitarium. Dr. Norwood had been sending the perfectly healthy parents of the children he was experimenting on to be experimented on themselves. I looked back through the children's file, and my other hunch was confirmed. All the children were from out of town: South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Rhode Island, and Tennessee. I finally got it. Imagine this. It's the early 1900s. There's no television, social media, or cell phones. People keep in touch through letters, for Christ's sake. Your child is terminally ill with cancer or some other illness, or perhaps it's you that's sick, and you've lost all hope, until you hear about Mineral Wells, Texas, home of the crazy water that heals all that ails you. You'll try anything. You pack up your bags and make the long journey to Texas. Once you're there, you'll try anything, and you're never heard from again. For it to work, the families would need to be from anywhere but Texas. Check. You'd need a network of conspirators to make sure all the loose ends were tied up. Check. Dr. Norwood got the children, and Millings got the parents or anyone else from the baker who was dealing with a psychological infirmity. If anyone ever tracked you down at Millings, which would be nearly impossible, who would believe your crazy stories? By that time, you'd be so drugged, emotionally scarred, or both, no one would dream of interrupting your treatment. Could law enforcement have been involved as well? The scope of it blew my mind. Think of all the suffering and death. Think of those poor children, all because of some foul-smelling water, the hope-filled human spirit in a group of doctors more sadistic than any you could imagine. Worms in the peach tree. I stayed in bed for the next 3 days. I had to call in sick to work, which was fine because I was rarely missing my shifts, but I wouldn't have cared either way. I was even deeper within the dullness now, like there was several inches of something between myself and the world. I could barely breathe through it. When I would get up for food or to use the restroom, I felt more like a marionette, pulling the corresponding strings for each body part than like myself. I wondered why I was the one paying for all the suffering that I had discovered. On the 4th day, I willed myself out of bed. I got dressed, put my gear on, and headed out the door. I had somewhere to be. The 20-minute drive to Weatherford, Texas definitely improved my mood a bit. The stark scenery, flat land and trees is calming sometimes. The Mineral Wells Public Library was closed indefinitely for repairs. Some issues with the contractors who were supposed to fix the roof. So the annual Mineral Wells Day presentation had been moved to Weatherford's Public Library. Our precinct likes its officers to participate in community events as much as possible, and this year was my turn to attend. The presentation concentrated on the rich history of Mineral Wells and the brave leaders that built it from a one-well town to a booming resort community. The irony did not escape me. J.A. Lynch was the ultimate hero of the day, but I knew otherwise. I sat in the back and listened off and on, but was mostly lost in my own thoughts. When it concluded, I stepped outside to speak briefly to one of the presenters to thank them for the support of our community outreach program. But a familiar face was already speaking to her. It was Mary Scott. I should have known I would see her here. We exchanged glances when she was done, and a moment later she walked over to me and spoke. "You look like hell, dear," she said, matter-of-factly. Oh, the honesty of Southern women. She could obviously tell something was wrong. "Appreciate that," I joked. A little levity never hurt anyone. "Mary, I found the files in the basement at the hospital. Dr. Norwood and his nurse were performing experiments on young children. and sending the parents over to Milling Sanitarium to get rid of the witnesses. Mary looked at me intently. I know, she said. A dagger shoved into my gut wouldn't have done any more damage than her words had. So I had risked my life and sanity in that basement for what? Some sick game she was playing? She looked around to see if anyone was listening, then motioned for me to follow her around the corner of the building. I had a mind to walk off, but followed against my better judgment. Only half of me hoped you'd find them. The other half? Well, I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I had my reasons. There are... She paused, trying to find the right word. Consequences for talking about the events of Mineral Wells past, from the living and the dead. Remember how I said I no longer drank the mineral water? Well, it did for many years of my life, which makes me vulnerable. She stopped and pulled up the sleeve on the shirt she was wearing. I saw 2 long lengthwise cuts that went from her wrist almost to her elbow, almost healed. They were just deep enough to bleed and scar, but not deep enough to hit any major veins. I did them myself, 2 days after our conversation, but I don't remember doing it. A warning, I suppose. From whom? I said, feeling the guilt rising inside me. I had gone from being angry at her to feeling sorry for her that quickly. My emotions were very unstable as of late. She hesitated briefly, like Stan had, then continued. Did those files mention Mr. Norwood's nurse? Marianne, I answered. She was my grandmother. The realization hit me like a bombshell. No wonder she didn't want to tell me. It also explained how she knew about the files and everything else. She went on. She came to Mineral Wells in 1910 seeking treatment for her mental disorder. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but my mother said she heard voices. Marianne was only 24 then. I guess Dr. Norwood thought he could use her. She had my mother Elise 6 years later. She paused again. I'm sorry, Mary. You don't have to tell me all this. It's too dangerous. My voice cracked. Yes, I do. It's time the truth came out. Growing up, you always think your parents are perfect. After you get a little older, you start to notice things about them. My mother was missing several fingers on her right hand and left hands. They had operated on her when she was a child. I found out later. She had other scars too. She was starting to cry. By her own mother? I asked, incredulous. Yes, which is how I know the same could happen to me. I saw my grandmother in my dreams the night I got these scars. I heard the bell, which meant it was time for one of the children to go with Mariana. It was my turn. She was now sobbing. I put my arms around her. The past is never dead, I thought. She wiped her eyes. Why my mother named me after her, I'll never understand. But perhaps she didn't either. She pulled away, then turned back around. Oh, there's one last thing. I tried to tell you this the last time we spoke. You need to go see Madame Teresa. She's here in Weatherford and does psychic readings. Pay no mind to the surface of what you see. That's only for the tourists. Teresa is an old soul. She should be able to help you. I almost balked, but thought better of it. If I'd seen and heard the dead with my own eyes and ears, it wasn't a huge leap to believe that someone else could speak to them. Thank you, I'll do it, I agreed. I hope she can help you the rest of the way. I have given you all I can. She looked like she meant it. It wasn't hard to find Miss Teresa. She was, after all, the only local business with a sign that bore the image of 2 hands holding a crystal ball, even if she was located several miles from the city limits. I still had my doubts, but I had no other option at this point. The small shop had seen better days. The carpet was purple and faded, and beads and other baubles hung from the low ceiling, haphazardly. The smell of eucalyptus and cinnamon filled the air, covering the smell of the cats that tramped around the room, for the most part at least. The sign inside said by appointment only, but I hoped she already knew I was coming. I took a seat at the large, ornately carved wooden table in the center of the room. That's when a woman appeared from behind the curtain in front of me. She wore a long dress, rough-spun and voluminous, with a hood on the back. She was dark-haired, and her wrinkled, sagging skin was the same. I could not see her eyes. She wore a mask over them, but instead of eye holes, the mask was solid, with eyes finely painted in their correct place. It was supremely unnerving, like looking at a life-size doll that had come to life. Mary sent me, was all I could muster. I see, she replied. Come with me. And with that she disappeared behind the curtain again. I slowly got up and followed her back. The room behind the curtain was much smaller than the main room, with only a small, simple wooden table in the middle. In the four corners of the room were small painted statues depicting animals, totems I believe they are called. A goose, a mountain lion, a hummingbird, and a gopher. I recognized the eyes. They were the same eyes that I had seen painted on Teresa's mask. She was already seated at the table, so I sat down across from her. I noticed her hands were as wrinkled and weathered as I had ever seen, but gentle somehow. I tried to focus on them. Looking at her face scared me, frankly. I sensed that she could feel my discomfort. We didn't have to speak about Mary or my purpose here. It was clear she understood. Can you speak to the dead? I managed to squeak out. I have spoken to them. Dead, you say? There is no death. There is only a change of worlds. That is why my people believe. Her voice rolled slowly and rhythmically, like a train rolling over its tracks. Why are they in mineral wells? And why are they tormenting the living? When man leaves this world, he passes into the spirit realm. Spirits are always around us, but the dead are not powerless. They can be incited to violence just as man can. Mineral wells and the water it is named after are cursed, but the exact source of this curse is hidden to me. I do have my guesses, though. In Pueblo mythology, there is a spirit known as Pishuni. I believe it is similar to the spirit depicted in the Christian Bible, who appears as a snake in the Garden of Eden. Pishuni is known as an interloper. His purpose is to create strife. It was he who tempted the first humans and disrupted their harmony with nature. I believe whomever first coaxed the mineral-rich water from the depths of the earth may have been visited by Pishuni. A deal may have been struck. The water would bring great wealth, but there would be a price. When the first men used the water to deceive those who honestly sought it, the price was exacted. The water was cursed, and all those who died in mineral wells while seeking the water would remain to exact their own vengeance against the ancestors of those who brought about their deaths. If it wasn't Pishuni, it may have been some other earth demon. In the end, it is of no consequence. It was ultimately man's lust for power and unsatiable greed that cursed mineral wells. I replayed all the strange events I had encountered during my time in mineral wells in my mind. Virginia Brown, James' great-grandmother, Mariana, the man at the VA, and even the children, all had come to mineral wells seeking treatment for something. There were others that I was unsure of, like the spirits involved in the Fort Walter suicide, Brad Delaney's murder of his wife, and the lawnmower accident, but I had a hunch those spirits had done the same. If I wasn't truly numb before, I was now. My eyes seemed to roll in my head. I'm not sure if I passed out, but all of a sudden Teresa's hands were mine. There's a dark cloud over you. You must be careful, she said cryptically. I looked around the room, trying to concentrate on something, and my eyes locked on the gopher totem. Although she couldn't see me, she knew. The totems, yes, they are for protection. My people believe that spirit animals can guard man from evil. They guard this room, one for water, one for mountain, one for air, and one for earth. The gopher guards the ground. Hopefully, he will guard you too. But your eyes? I started, not thinking clearly. I can see better without them. I slowly regained my composure and stood up shakily. Teresa put her arms around me and guided me into the main room. As I was about to leave, she spoke again. There's something else. I hesitate to say this to you in your condition, but I must. You have a friend in grave danger. I was already out the door, stumbling to my squad car. I arrived at Mary's house about 15 minutes later. It was evening, and the sun was creeping behind the horizon, painting the sky with multicolored hues of lavender and red. I didn't notice any of her dogs running about as I pulled up with my lights on and sirens blasting, neglecting to turn them off as I exited the vehicle. I drew my weapon instinctively, even though it had little chance of protecting me or Mary from an evil spirit. I slowly crept toward the door and found it unlocked. I was barely seeing clearly at this point, but found my way inside. My boots squished on the floor of the living room. I looked down to find the carpet soaked with so much blood that had created a standing puddle, one that I was forced to walk through rather than around. This went against every bit of my training, but I was not thinking clearly at the time. The dullness had almost overcome me. It was then I noticed there were body parts floating in the sea of red. A tongue, a foot, an eye. I retched once, and then again. In a daze I followed the trail of blood through the living room and into the kitchen. It was worse there. The entire floor was red, and there were more body parts. Pieces of flesh and bone, may be more accurate. It was hard to make out anything among the gore. The smell of death permeated the air. Or was that only my fear? Through my tears, I found my way through the kitchen and around the small island in the center. It was there I found Mary, or what was left of her. Slumped against the far cabinets, her face wasn't hers anymore. It seemed to me like someone professionally done movie prop. Her nose had been sliced cleanly off, and there were 2 bloody holes where her eyes had been. I wish I had Teresa's mask to cover them up. Maybe then she could see again like Teresa. The truth finally sank in. This was all my fault. I had dragged Mary into this, and she had lost her life helping me. I had killed her. My knees collapsed and I sank into the grime. My hand landed on something cold and slippery that appeared to have fallen from Mary's hand. A large kitchen cleaver. They found me covered in gore and vomit right where I had collapsed. The neighbors had gotten tired of the constantly blaring sirens and called the police. James was there along with several other officers. "Jesus Christ, man. It's a bloodbath in here. What happened?" he asked incredulously. It was too late. I tried to stop it. I whispered as he pulled me up onto my feet. "Who did this?" It was, but I couldn't put the words together. What could I say? "Is any of this your blood? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine." I'm not fine, I thought. In minutes, the whole team was there, rolling out the yellow tape, photographing everything and collecting evidence. In a small town like Mineral Wells, you won't see everyone in hazmat suits dusting things for fingerprints and setting up lasers that show the trajectory of bullets and such. The investigators do mostly everything, and they do it really well most of the time, although I would have hated to be the guy that had to collect all of those body parts. My clothes, shoes, and the rest of the gear I was wearing were collected in clear plastic bags. I was photographed from head to toe, and blood swabs were taken. Because I was an officer, I was allowed to go home and shower before heading up to the precinct to give my statement. I know that any other civilian would have been arrested on the spot. I arrived at the precinct, showered and clean-shaven, my black satchel on my shoulder. I was taken back to the room where we interview criminals, asked to sit, and offered a cup of coffee. I politely declined. We have a little camcorder set up in the corner that was switched on after the tedious process of deleting some old interviews. I was nervous at that point. Shouldn't I be meeting with a superior to simply give my statement? Instead, I was read my Miranda rights. I decided to decline my right to have an attorney present while I was questioned. I had nothing to hide. Looking back now, I realized that was my first mistake. But considering that almost catatonic emotional state I had been in for some time, logic and reason had deserted me, and the fire inside of me, the one inside all of us that urges us to fight at all costs, had been all but extinguished. I told my story from beginning to end. The possessions, the experiments, and even what Teresa said, all of it. It had to come out. I showed them the files as proof. I pleaded with my fellow officers to stop drinking the water and to start looking into the strange occurrences in mineral wells. I begged them to help me shut down the company bottling and shipping this cursed water across the country. They played along, maybe just to keep me talking. But the looks I got when I explained Mary had mutilated herself, well, let's just say they weren't friendly. I'm sure you can imagine how it went. "Why were you at her home that night?" A psychic told me she was in danger. Officer rolls eyes and scoffs. "Sure, buddy, we believe you. Now tell us about these ghosts you saw again." Afterwards, I was placed on temporary leave and taken to a holding cell. The next several weeks were a blur. I was placed under official arrest soon after my interview and held without bond. Can you blame them? It was a gruesome scene. I was covered in blood. It appeared as if I had handled a murder weapon, and hell, she was cut into pieces for Christ's sake. The medical examiner stated that no human would have been able to survive long enough to do that to themselves without bleeding out. Plus, even if she could have, why would Mary have done this to herself? It made no sense. I learned later that my arrest was never reported, but I wasn't surprised. Can you imagine how local cop arrested for mutilation of retired teacher would have gone over in the local paper? The police department would have had to deal with a shitstorm like of which they had never experienced before. Controversies like that don't go away very easily, if ever, in small towns like Mineral Wells. Luckily, the grand jury was meeting that month, so I didn't have long to wait. My case was fast-tracked and quickly presented. To no one's surprise, the grand jury returned a true bill. I was indicted for murder under Texas Penal Code 19.02. It can carry up to life in prison. As you can imagine, getting indicted for murder for a crime you didn't commit is a crushing feeling. What's worse is that I knew I had no chance to convince anyone that I was innocent. The police department had the files, which didn't really prove anything anyway, but I knew they would never see the light of day again. Even if Stan and Teresa could have come forward with some other credible evidence, there is no way they would be believed. The veil would prevent it. So, I sat alone in my cell, mostly crying, often sleeping, receding deeper into the dullness, pretending this was all a dream. I slept in restless fits, racked by night terrors. At this point, my friends, I have to make a confession. This will be my first of 2 confessions, and is in fact the only thing I am guilty of. I have deceived you. I am no longer a police officer in Texas, as I said at the beginning. Although you might have guessed that already, I apologize for that, sincerely. If I had told you what my true situation's up front, it's likely you wouldn't have listened to my story. I needed you to believe me. One of the foundations of the criminal justice system in this country is that to be found guilty of an offense, you have to have had a rational understanding of what you were doing at the time. After a hearing, motioned for by my attorney, the court found that I was in fact not competent to stand trial for what I had done. He presented evidence of erratic behavior from the time I had arrived in Mineral Wells up through the night of the murder. Some of it was true, some of it wasn't. I'm almost positive my attorney personally thought I was guilty and mentally sound, but he successfully painted the picture of a stressed-out cop who has simply snapped. This was perfect for the district attorney's office and the police department. There would be no public trial. No one would find out about the psychopathic officer who cut an innocent woman into pieces. Texas, like other states, provides for a different type of punishment for people who fall into this category, which brings me to my second confession. I'm currently confined in a secure mental facility, serving a 40-year term of commitment for a crime I did not commit. I only have access to my phone every couple of days and at certain times, which is why I've had to break up repeating this story to someone who took it down. You may be surprised I have access to it at all, but you shouldn't be. Inmates smuggling cell phones into prison is an enormous problem in today's justice system. The problem is, the guards are all in on it. They make a little money by helping the inmate or looking the other way and, of course, deny everything if the inmate is caught. It hadn't taken much money to bribe my orderly into letting me use mine on occasion. I had plenty saved, considering I was single, had no social life, and never ate or drank out. I was able to contact Stan through his garage and have him deliver the money for me. He got a small cut too. Human greed, right? I'm also sorry that this may not have ended how you hoped. I think Hollywood movies have conditioned us to believe conflicts always resolve tidily, often to the benefit of the protagonist. If you just believe, or strive hard enough, or fight long enough, you'll win. They have to, or otherwise people wouldn't continue to watch them. That's a good thing for the most part. There will be no happy ending here. Unfortunately, life isn't always like that. It's dark, gruesome, and unfair more often than we'd like to admit, and we have to live with the scars. There will be no justice for Mary, those children, or any of the victims in Mineral Wells, Texas. There will certainly be no justice for me. I fell victim to something even more sinister than the curse. Hope. The idea that we can change things. That we can make the wrong right again. I was wrong about the nature of the world, and it cost me everything. The meds I'm administered every day at 9 and 3 help some. I'm numb mostly, and I can sleep. I wouldn't have been able to live with the night terrors. Thankfully, the dullness has mostly faded away. Oh, I see it's time for me to go. I must leave you. The time is good. It's time for one of my treatments. Yes, I have those too. Some traditional and some experimental, but they will have to be tales for another day. I've actually gotten used to the screams here, even though they echo in my dreams.